Heathenry, be it Asatru, Norse paganism, or any of the various names that it goes by in the 21st century, you're probably doing it wrong. Who am I to say such things? I am Kadric Olson, author of Runes for Transformation and founder of Galdracraft. For the past 30 years, I've been studying Norse mysticism and reading the Norse literature in the original languages to try to pull out practical ways that you can use the wisdom of these ancient people today in ways that will enrich your life. So now, to understand how you might be doing heathenry wrong, we need to take a look at how Norse culture was derailed throughout history. And by derailed, I mean that different people misrepresented, misappropriated, misused, and misinterpreted the Norse traditions for their own social, political, or entertainment benefits. Now, we do need to be sure that the Norse people themselves are the first culprits to do so. You see, when they would tell their stories of their heroes and their ancestors, every time they told the story, they exaggerated just a little bit more, embellishing the abilities of the hero for entertainment purposes. We do the same thing today with the action movie, where the hero has some supernatural, superhuman capabilities. The Norse did the same. Another thing that happened is the Norse did travel the world. They did encounter various cultures, and sometimes the interactions were not necessarily so positive. And we hear the maxim that usually history is written by the victors. In a lot of the cases with the Norse, history was written by the sore losers. So we're already off to a shaky start with Norse literature from their own mouths, for their own hands, and from the people that they encountered, already kind of not giving them a proper representation throughout history. However, the first major blow to Norse culture actually came around the year 1000 to the 1300s. This is when Europe had become primarily Christian. This was the dominant religion, and they were spreading their influence throughout the world, and this included Scandinavia. In the year 1000, Iceland officially converted to Christianity, and it was with a stipulation that you could practice the pagan religion in private. It took around the 1300s before parts of Sweden finally officially converted over to paganism. Now, when this happened, many of the old pagan sites were destroyed, burned to the ground. Churches were built on top of them in hopes that this culture would disappear. The gods were demonized and eradicated from the record books. Didn't work too well. One of the good things that Christianity did bring into Scandinavia was the written word and books. This enabled a previously oral culture to write down their stories so that they could be preserved for centuries. This is why we have the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, why we have the sagas. However, the people inscribing these tales were Christians, and so they imbued them, they embossed them, they exaggerated them and changed them to fit Christian ideology. They removed certain pagan references. We don't really have a good understanding of the practices of the Norse people because the Christians writing down the Norse culture of the time eliminated a lot of the pagan practices. So as much as we revere the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, they're really not an accurate portrayal of what Norse culture was like. Now, as the centuries progressed, Norse culture was kind of forgotten. The books gathered dust. They just kind of were quiet. That is, until around the early 1900s, when the Wagnerian Society in Germany found these books and resurrected them from the dust. They did some really good things because they were able to collect all of these old sagas, tell them to each other. They were able to print out new books so that these sagas could live on for the future generations. And so what these Wagnerian societies was like was basically a bunch of rich people drinking wine out of glass horns, telling exaggerated Viking stories, romanticized Viking stories, wearing dress-up clothes as Viking. This is where we actually get Viking helmets with horns and wings. Previous to this, the Vikings didn't have that. In fact, nobody in their right mind would go into combat with horns on their helmet. There is some archaeological evidence which does suggest that the Norse did have horned helmets for ceremonial use. Again, we don't know what that ceremony looked like. We don't know how they used them. One of the little intricate things that the Wagnerian society did is with language. They added an A to the end of certain words like Valhall, Frigg, Idun, and Hel. This is where we actually get the term Valhalla, Frigga, Iduna, and Hela. Back in the Norse literature itself, it was Valhall, not Valhalla. Another thing that they invented was the term the web of weird. In my digging throughout the lore, I cannot find a reference of anything called the web of weird before the Wagnerian society. Yes, the Eddas talk about the Norns risting the runes. They talk about the Norns and Disir spinning threads of fate and stretching these threads of fate and cutting the threads of fate. However, there's no reference to them weaving and no reference to weaving a web of weird. And you have to remember, in Old Norse and in the Norse languages, weird is actually pronounced urth, and urth has a well, not a web. However, I will hold that the Norse poets, the skalds, would have loved the alliterative references of web of weird, but again, it's not accurate. Now, perhaps the worst thing that the Wagnerian society did with Norse culture is they romanticized the tales of Viking exploits into dramatic, romantic tales. In essence, what these Wagnerians did to the Vikings is what Disney did to the Pirates of the Caribbean. Yeah, Wagnerian Vikings are Disney pirates. Now, the next misappropriation of Norse culture would come only a few decades later, still in Germany. This is as the Nazi regime struggled to get a foothold on the world. Now, doing this, they pulled every string that they could to bolster their failing ideology, and this included altering ancient tales and adopting runes and Norse mysticism. They used the runes and symbols found throughout the Norse as a way to try to denote their ideologies. They even tried to adopt the mystical and magical practices, but their dishonorable intentions did not mesh with the honorable ancient tradition, and so they failed miserably. And you'll even see people today attempting to cling to the old Nazi values, pairing them with Norse mysticism and runes, and they're failing too. Now, we can look to J.R.R. Tolkien, a scholar of the Norse traditions, and this is what he had to say in his own words. I'm going to paraphrase it a bit, but these are his own words about the Nazis misappropriating Norse culture. I have in this war a burning private grudge against that ruddy little ignoramus Adolf Hitler, ruining, perverting, misapplying, and making forever accursed that noble northern spirit, a supreme contribution to Europe, which I have ever loved and tried to present in its true light. If you need another step, let's take a look at the words of Edred Thorson from his book, An Introduction to the Germanic Tradition. This is what he has to say about the Nazis and the Norse tradition. It should be emphasized that the true Germanic tradition harbors no ill will toward any other people or race. The Germanic peoples of old were in fact quite xenophilic. They were very friendly to foreign peoples and ideas. This is at the root of our sometimes unbalanced love affair with the exotic and multicultural today. Another side of Edred Thorson, his real name, Stephen Flowers, he works with the Temple of Set and the Order of the Trapezoid. I know those words are going to trigger some people, but he still has his PhD in Germanic studies. He still knows what he's talking about despite that. And from the website of the Order of the Trapezoid, I do believe this is Edred Thorson, Stephen Flowers writing this, about the Wewelsburg Castle. And what's so interesting about the Wewelsburg Castle is emblazoned on the floor is the black sun, a symbol that we find through a lot of modern neo-Nazis using it, and the Nazi Party tried to use it, and again, failed. But this is what Stephen Flowers has to say about the Wewelsburg Castle. This was a site where another experiment had gone awry. where the positive aspects of German Romanticism, dynamism, life worship, irrationality, artistic alchemy, and xenophilia had tragically become the tools of totalitarianism, negative tribalism, and brutal acts committed on a mass scale. So there we have two scholars of the Norse tradition weighing in on the destruction of the Norse culture at the hands of the Nazis. So even these peoples, these scholars, agree that Nazism and the Old Norse practices are not compatible. Finally, we come to the modern era with movies and television. They do give us compelling visions of strong, stoic warriors that are presented as rough, brutal, primitive, and highly aggressive combatants. A lot of people aspire to be like the Vikings they see on TV. And this comes, from the Vikings movie in 1958 with Kirk Douglas, Hail Ragnar's beard, even to the present-day Viking TV series where they give us accounts of the most likely fictional character, Ragnar Lothbrok. And it seems that Hollywood sensationalism just further capitalized on the exaggerations that the Old Norse already put into their own tales that were further exaggerated and romanticized by the Wagnerians. Now, I will give you, these fictional tales do provide us with entertainment. They're a lot of fun to watch, and that is the primary purpose of these productions. However, you need to understand that their depictions of the Old Norse people and even the Vikings are grossly inaccurate. So if you see it on TV and the movies, it's probably not real. And if you're raising a horn, emulating what you see in the media, you're probably not really honoring the ancestors and the gods. You're probably just playing modern dress-up Viking. So heathenry, be it Asatru, Norse paganism, any of the other names it goes by, it used to be considered the religion with homework. There was a lot of study involved with it. Lately, it's become the religion with weightlifting. I hold that it can be both. You need to work your body and you need to work your mind. If you're lifting, read. If you do cardio, CrossFit, study. Do them both. Strengthen your mind and strengthen your body. Because if you really want to understand who the Old Norse people were, you need to be reading the primary and the secondary resources. Get yourself different translations of the poetic and the prose Eddas. Look the different translations up. Try maybe your own translation of the work. You'll learn something very interesting doing that. Also, read the fucking sagas. They're boring. They're long. They're dragged out. They are boring. But you will learn so much about what the Old Norse culture could have been, what it might have been like, even though, yes, it was tainted by Christian scribes. You need to be reading these primary sources. Then, get a hold of some of the secondary sources. There are some very good books out there by people who have advanced degrees in Germanic and Scandinavian studies. People like R.I. Page, H.R. Hilda Davidson, Stephen Flowers, and Jackson Crawford. All of their books are very good and give a deeper understanding beyond what you can get out of the primary literature. And also, stay on top of archaeological discoveries. Sometimes what they find underground refutes the literature. Sometimes it confirms the literature. But in every case, what is being discovered gives us a better insight to who the Old Norse people were, what they believed, how they practiced, and how they lived. And those are important things to know. Now, I'm not here to tell you what heathenry is supposed to look like, how you're supposed to practice, or even if you're doing it right. You need to understand even the ancestors didn't do it the same way. It depended on the different region, the different village, the different time period. It was always different. There was no one way to do heathenry. All I'm presenting is how this ancient noble culture got misrepresented, misinterpreted, misused, and misappropriated for social, political, and entertainment purposes. Now, you get to choose what kind of a heathen you are, and you get to choose how you practice your heathenry. But I'll hold that if you're doing any of the stuff I outlined before in this video, you're doing heathenry wrong. Hail to you.